Donkey Kong meets Crash Bandicoot, and it sounds like an instant buy, right? Well, that's exactly what Nico DeRico The Magical World aims to be, a nostalgic platformer blending the best of both worlds. That said though, the game had a rocky start on the Switch, releasing with some bugs that held it back. But now, with a patch in place, we can finally dive into this adventure. So is it worth your time now that it's patched up? Let's find out. So if you do enjoy this video today, subscribe, it helps out the channel a huge amount. So the story then in Nico DeRico The Magical World is pretty standard for the platforming genre. In the opening moments, you uncover a mysterious artifact after narrowly avoiding traps and a few, let's say, near-death experiences. So think Bandicoot meets Indiana Jones for this setup. But as we are escaping, things naturally go wrong when this artifact is stolen by the evil Grimbold and his army. Now what follows is a quest to retrieve it. While the story isn't breaking any new ground, the delivery is solid. You will get the occasional cutscene to keep the momentum going, and as you venture through new biomes, brief conversations add a little bit more depth. It's entertaining enough and smartly keeps things moving quickly, aside from the opening cutscene, which is maybe a few minutes in length total. So let's start first of all with the obvious issues at launch. Nico DeRico The Magical World hit the Switch without its day one patch. While it went live on other platforms, the Switch version was left waiting. This meant players encountered several problems: long load times, gameplay bugs, even an in-game store that wouldn't actually let you access it despite reaching the necessary point in the experience. To make things clear here though, this wasn't the fault of the dev team or publisher. Unfortunately, this kind of delay is common, as Nintendo are notorious for taking longer to approve patches compared to Sony and Microsoft. In fact, behind the scenes running a channel like this, it's not unusual for Switch creators and media to wait for updates while other platforms are far ahead. But the big question, does the arrival of the patch fix the issues? And I'm gonna say, well, some of them, like the in-game store, absolutely resolved. You can now access it without a hitch. But sadly, not all problems have been fully ironed out. Now, before we do dive into the specifics, let's talk about the game itself. So Nico DeRico The Magical World is an adventure platformer that blends 2D sections with 3D moments. And I've got to say, the transitions between the two are seamless and genuinely impressive. Now, is it groundbreaking the experience? No, not really. It's not going to win any awards for originality, but its inspirations are some of the best in the genre, and honestly, I'm fine with that. Especially since Nintendo gives very little love to Donkey Kong these days, no matter how much fans ask for it. It also then supports 2-player local co-op, which is definitely a nice touch. As for the mechanics then, Nico DeRico The Magical World keeps things relatively simple with a variety of enemies and straightforward abilities. You can jump, wall jump, ground pound, slide attack, and bounce on enemies' heads, take them out. Plus there's a handy spin attack for those moments when you are swimming, and these controls transition seamlessly between the 2D and 3D sections, keeping it very natural. Now, like any good platformer, it's really the enemies and level design that push you to master the control scheme. You know, different enemies require different strategies, so you won't always want to approach them the same way. So for example, jumping on the back of a hedgehog, definitely not a great idea, unless you're okay with losing one of your 3 lives. Now the levels challenge you to adapt with biomes like water-filled locations, collapsing jungle platforms, and pits of doom to navigate. And each of these biomes, it introduces fresh objectives and obstacles that keep you on your toes, constantly evolving the experience. Now is it easy? Not particularly, but thankfully there are a decent amount of checkpoints to save your progress. There's also an easy difficulty option for those that do want to dial the challenge back a dash. That's always a nice inclusion to see, because I know, Crash Bandicoot, Donkey Kong, they can, let's face it, definitely trip people up. On top of all of this then, it is borrowing sequences heavily from its influences, specifically Donkey Kong. Expect cannon sequences that require perfect timing, minecart sections that test your reflexes, button mashing minigames to cap off levels, and you'll also encounter free mounts to assist you in traversal, starting with a frog that grants a higher jump, and later a dinosaur that can suck up enemies to use them as ammo. I really enjoyed these, but the copycat nature of them, it's, well, let's face it, undeniable. As you progress through each level then, you're going to notice a huge amount of collectibles scattered throughout, and some of these servers currency for the aforementioned store, while others, they're driving that replayability quite heavily, like letters that spell Nico, or hidden artifacts that give you the ability to purchase mounts, allowing you to use them whenever you see fit rather than the game's predefined, specific markers. While the store then doesn't drastically change the gameplay, it is still admittedly a nice touch. It gives you something to work towards beyond just completing levels. Additionally, there are secret hidden levels to discover. These are quick challenges that test your platforming skills or require you to defeat, let's say, a certain number of enemies. It just adds a dash of variety, and I'm never going to complain at that. The game then took me around 5 hours to complete, which might feel a little short for some players, but for the genre, I think it feels just right. Plus, I was far from wrapping up all of the collectibles, so there's plenty left here after that time for the completionists out there. The boss encounters are also worth mentioning. They're good fun, often screen-filling, and like many in the genre, it's really all about pattern recognition and figuring out how to deal damage. While far from difficult, at least in comparison to the main platforming, they definitely serve as a satisfying way to cap off each world. Now, however, onto the problems, and I do want to be clear here. Look, the patch, it did fix a number of issues. Text problems during dialogue exchanges were reported, fixed. The inaccessible store, fixed. Players reporting crashes. I encountered no such issues. Sadly though, not everything is perfect. One major promised fix was quicker load times, and while they've supposedly improved, they are still far from ideal. In fact, the load screens are lengthy. Getting into each level feels like a lifetime, often taking 30 seconds or more. Perhaps the most disappointing aspect though is the frame rate. It's aiming for 30 FPS, I would have much preferred to see it hit 60, especially for the genre, but worse still here is it's not even a stable 30. While I wouldn't say there are any major drops, it fluctuates a few frames either side of 30, and that instability means it just lacks that buttery smoothness you'd hope for, and it's actually compounded then by the controls as well. For me, the controls feel floaty. I'd say that is by design, so that's fine. But there's actually a slight input lag that becomes infuriating as the difficulty ramps up. You'll eventually get used to it, but it just lacks the responsiveness of the genre's, best. And I took many hits that I feel were due to this issue. So now though, let's talk about the visuals, and overall I'd say they're largely decent during gameplay. The world is vibrant with a nice variety of biomes. They also do some interesting things with lighting, such as characters appearing as silhouettes, and with the depth of field, objects often appear in the foreground. It adds this real nice 2.5D feeling to things, and yeah, even the aforementioned transitions, 2D to 3D, the camera pans here, they're so well done, there's really no interruption. In fact, I will say this as well, characters and enemies themselves look great too, really nice amount of variety. Again though, sadly, I'm going to say it, not all is perfect. Pixelation is apparent throughout the game, it adds kind of a budget feel to some of the locations, and additionally, resolution issues just rear their head during cutscenes and load screens with noticeable downgrades in quality that can be just jarring, frankly. Perhaps the biggest visual issue for me though, it actually comes in the form of screen tearing during the cutscenes. It's a real shame as well because the animations during these scenes, they're clearly well done, but the constant screen tearing I guess, disrupts the narrative, and that's really the last thing you want. Now though, let's move on to the audio, and I'm happy to say this is a strong point for Nico de Rico, The Magical World. Characters have suitably over-the-top sound effects that always reinforce the action on screen. It adds a layer of charm, plus we even get voice acting throughout, which goes a long way in elevating the delivery of the narrative. Perhaps so the most exciting part though is the soundtrack, composed by none other than David Wise. Now you might not recognize the name right away, but he's the genius musician behind the soundtracks for the Donkey Kong series, and it shows here in just how the soundtrack perfectly complements the game's tone, and yeah, it's clear love for that particular series. Now let's wrap things up, and while I'm not going to say Nico de Rico, The Magical World is full of fresh ideas because, well, let's be honest, a lot of them are just lifted straight from the greats Donkey Kong and Crash, I do at least love the concept. The blend of 2D and 3D combined with seamless transitions, it's impressive. However, I've got my fair share of issues that just hold the experience back for me. It leaves me questioning, why don't I just go play Tropical Freeze or the Crash Bandicoot library again? Now, had we gotten the same build from other platforms, I have no doubt this review would be glowing, but on the Switch, there are still a lot of issues that need correcting. The slightly unstable 30 FPS, the input lag that becomes frustrating, the screen tearing throughout the cutscenes, and those long load times. I'll probably get some stick for this score because I'm seeing a lot of praise elsewhere, but for me, while it's definitely easy to see the fun in the experience, it still needs a fair amount of work to really deliver what it promised. So with that in mind, it's an above average 6 out of 10 from me. However, a couple of solid patches could easily bump this one up to an 8, maybe even a 9, so I'll definitely be keeping a close eye on it. So will you be checking out Nico DeRico? Let me know in the comments. Maybe you've been playing it already. Would love to hear your thoughts. With that, hit subscribe, join us here for reviews, deals, news and lists daily, and I'll see you all on the next video. Thanks everyone.